This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. While Donald Trump's executive order suspending the entry of all refugees into the United States has been temporarily stayed by the courts, uncertainty about U.S. refugee policy going forward continues. Beyond calling for the temporary ban, the order drastically cuts the number of refugees to be allowed in fiscal 2017 and makes it easier for state and local governments to refuse refugee placements. The court is yet to rule on these provisions. Our guest today is on the front lines of refugee resettlement and has been paying very close attention to these developments. Mary Flynn has managed the Refugee Resettlement Services program of Lutheran Social Services of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan since 2009. Mary, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I wonder if we could start out with sort of a definition of terms. In a recent book review, actually, in the New Yorker, Joyce Carol Oates was drawing a distinction between expats, immigrants, and refugees in sort of a descending order of sort of the perception. So an expat is someone who's very cosmopolitan and comes here just because they want to and they work. And immigrant, there's some sense of need on their part and in some bit of duress. And refugee is sort of on the far end of that spectrum. So talk a little bit about what the term means to the people that you work with.
In terms of my job, I kind of look at it as 1, 2, and 3. Immigrants choose to leave their home country. They could stay and be okay, but they choose to request to come to the United States. There are asylees who leave their country voluntarily. Sometimes they can stay, but once they come to the United States, for instance, they might say, I can't go back. And they apply and try to present their story of why they need protection from their home country. So there's 2 countries involved there. Refugees is really 3 countries. They're at home. They're forced to flee. There's violence, there's terror, there's threats. And they go to a second country and ask for safe haven and shelter. And the second country might say, you can stay here for a while, but you can't stay here permanently. There's about 25 to 55 million registered refugees in the world. Those are people that flee their home country and get to a second country and are interviewed and receive full refugee status. But only about 100,000 of those people make it to the United States each year. And that's what makes a refugee is fleeing their home country, seeking shelter and safety in a second, and eventually relocating in a third country. And that third country is not always their choice.
So just worth noting on those numbers, those are really historically high. I mean, I think you often hear, not since World War II has the number of refugees globally been where it is now.
There's a lot of trouble on a lot of fronts, and the United Nations really keeps an eye on that across the world. And when they see situations in which there's going to be permanent displacement and an inability to ever return home, that's when they really start the refugee interview process and give people that designation if they pass the very compelling interviews that are required to achieve that status. It's not easy to become a refugee. You go through multiple interviews, sometimes time-lapse interviews. They'll take families apart and interview them separately. And they may do this over a period of a couple years. Once again, before the executive order, about 100,000 people were supposed to come to the United States. Out of the tens of millions of people, your chances of getting here are very slim. And actually, only 1% of all people who apply for refugee status actually receive it. So
how does, in the U.S. context at least, how does immigration law differ from refugee resettlement law? And is there any connection?
You know, I'm not a legal expert about that sort of thing. I work for a refugee resettlement agency, and our activities and our status for the clients coming in is very clear. Refugees arrive with permanent legal status in the United States. For the rest of their lives, they are entitled and have legal documentation to be here. Now, when they arrive as a refugee, they have the refugee status. And in 1 year, they have to do something called adjustment of status, and they have to apply for a green card to become a legal permanent resident. That kind of solidifies their status in the United States, makes it much more stable. But then at 5 years, they're also eligible and required to try to achieve citizenship. And at that point, they become a citizen just like you or I. So it's a very clear, very concrete pathway.
So what does the infrastructure look like? I mean, there's really a unique partnership between the U.S. Department of State and private sector agencies like yours, isn't it? Are there other players in the puzzle?
There's a lot of players in the puzzle. Resettlement agencies do not go out and solicit refugee allocations. This is a very organized process on an international level. And it's United Nations, and then it goes to the International Organization on Migration. And then if they're put on the list for the United States, it goes to the Refugee Processing Center, who does all of the United States-based clearance and security screenings and interviews and everything.
So at this point, we're still at the U.S. government level.
We're actually not in the United States yet.
Right. Okay.
So the Refugee Processing Center is the final place before the cases that are thoroughly vetted and approved for resettlement in the United States. That list then goes to the Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugee, and Migration, called PRM. PRM sits at a table about as big as the one that we're sitting at right now every Wednesday, and the 9 national agencies called VOLAGs, voluntary agencies, sit down and they allocate the refugee cases for that week to agencies in the United States. We're a member of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services because we're a member of Lutheran Social Services of Wisconsin and Upper Michigan.
So that umbrella organization is one of the 9.
Correct.
Okay.
And Lutheran Immigration and Refugee, commonly called LIRS, has 26 affiliate sites and about 40 to 50 offices in the United States. So there are 9 of these agencies. So you can see that the resettlement network is actually quite sophisticated and complex in the United States. And it's been in place for over 40 years. So it's understandable that it's a very mature system. If a person happens to have a family member or knows somebody that already lives in Wisconsin, when they're sitting at the table at that weekly allocation meeting, they might say, we have a Burmese Rohingya case. They say that they have a brother that's already in Milwaukee. Who has an agency in Milwaukee? It might be LIRS. And then that's how a case would come to Milwaukee. Our job starts at the airport. We have no influence on pre-arrival processing. We take all of our allocations from the Department of State through our national agency and then down to the local level.
So assuming there wasn't an obvious connection, the Burmese family doesn't have a Milwaukee connection, how are the decisions made as to where they would go?
There's 2 statuses of refugees, U.S. tie cases and no U.S. tie cases. A U.S. tie case is someone who knows somebody here and requests to be placed close to them for support. Then there's a no U.S. tie case. They can go to any agency in the country that accepts no U.S. tie cases. Some resettlement agencies only accept U.S. tie cases. Some agencies accept both, and we're one of those agencies, along with several others in Milwaukee.
So this was not always the case in this country. I mean, Canada, for example, we've seen in the news, has a number of individual families looking for refugees to adopt, if you will. And so it seems like it's much more of an individual system there. Is that always the case here? Was it like that once here?
When refugee resettlement first started in the organized fashion that we know now. That started in about 1974. There were agencies like Lutheran Social Services, but it was much more direct placement with churches or community groups. But there was also, it was very scattered. Like, there would be a family placed in Milwaukee and a family placed in Ashland, Wisconsin. Wherever there was a church, primarily churches, and primarily Catholic churches in the early years of this organization of resettlement, who accepted families to be placed near them or with them. But a few years back, PRM determined that refugees really weren't doing that well, and that they needed to be around other people like them a little bit more often than being scattered and isolated. And I would agree with that. People do need common foods possibly of their childhood. I mean, we always talk about comfort foods, and refugees have comfort foods as well. It's also very important that people have some connection to their past life. You can't just cut that off and never experience that again. Mentally, physically, people just wouldn't do well, and that is not why people were brought here. We don't want people to suffer more once they're here. So a few years back, before I came on board, actually in December of 2009, PRM already had indicated geographical boundaries. And refugees have to be placed, if they're a no U.S. tie case, they have to be placed within 50 miles of our resettlement site. If they have a friend or family that they want to live by, they have to live within 100 miles of our site. So there is some efforts being made by the government to make sure that people do well emotionally, physically, and spiritually as well.
So I'm sure, having been at this a while, you've got some sense sort of longitudinally of how the families do. I mean, in general, what is that acculturation process like? I mean, do people generally make a go of it after a few years?
They make a go of it after a couple weeks. Until I worked with Refugee Resettlement, I did not know. I mean, I wasn't inside it. I didn't know the information. It just was something that I knew was kind of happening, but I really wasn't on my radar. When I was assigned this position and asked by my agency if I would consider working in this department, I trust my agency. They do good work. I was happy to be associated with them. But what a life changer that was. I really, to this day, am totally amazed and grateful for this opportunity that's been given to me, because I see America a whole different way, and I'm really quite surprised how patriotic I've become in a way that I didn't expect. I'm a product of the 60s and 70s. Very much challenging the status quo, free thinking, thinking for yourself, but also watching our democratic process at work all the time. Working with refugees, I have come to see that democratic process as truly a gift that I was totally unaware of. And anybody that gets involved with refugees comes to realize that as well very, very quickly. Refugees, I wish I had a picture with me. Somebody gave me a picture of two refugees in a camp, and above their heads is a picture of the White House that they painted. And that was their hope and dream. That is their beacon to have the White House there. And we don't know if those men ever made it to the United States or not. The person who took the picture left before they did. Don't know where they are. I hope they made it, and I hope that they someday get to see the White House for themselves. We have refugees that get off the plane and say, how soon can I start working? Well, wait a minute, you have to get a Social Security number first. That's going to take a few weeks. I want to start working right away. It's really humbling to see how motivated people are and how the opportunity of America is so real to them. And because it's real to them and I see that, it's much more real to me, and I love it.
So in the time you've been doing this, talk a little bit about how things have changed, both in terms of number and sort of countries of origin of the families you're working with.
Since I started working in refugee resettlement in 2009, it's been a constant change, and it's very diverse. When I first started working in the department, there was primarily refugees from Burma. And every state in Burma has its own culture and its own language. But we were primarily working with a handful of them. We were working with Karen, a lot of Karenni, and Chin. Now we're also working with Rohingya, who are actually the majority population in Arakan state, but minority religiously in the country. So they're persecuted across the board by everybody. We're working with Somali and Somali Bantu. We've received cases of Hmong, which also was a big surprise to me. Having watched the Vietnam War in my childhood and the protests in the 70s and the big influx of Hmong refugees in 1974 through the 2000s, and now to realize that there are still people fleeing that war trauma to this day is surprising. You know, it really is surprising. So it's been very diverse. We went from about 300 refugees a year in Milwaukee to about 340 in 2009 and 2010. Then in 2011, there was actually a bit of a lull in arrivals for Somali and Iraqi, Middle Easterners, just like now. But back then it was based on the fact that security checks were not being done as thoroughly and as consistently as they should have been. And the government knew that. So they took a step back, took a deep breath. Other refugee arrivals continued, but not to the degree that they had been. The government cleared their backlog of security checks, and then the Iraqi and the Somali refugee arrivals continued in fairly great numbers. We went from about 70,000 in 2012 and 13 to, we were expected 85,000 in fiscal year 2016. In 2017, we were told to expect 110,000. And I should clarify that that's nationwide. And now we're down to 50,000, we're thinking, for 2017. So it's very dynamic. You have to take each day as it comes, just like refugees do.
So, you know, the subtext in our conversation today is, in fact, the executive order. How has that changed your work just immediately?
Well, immediately we had a young man who was 24 years old from Sudan, who we expected to arrive on Monday, I believe January 30th. And he, in fact, had his travel canceled on that Friday, on January 27th. So that was an immediate response. Refugee resettlement was effectively stopped on that day. When the other court ruling took effect a week later, they said people that had valid visas issued and travel scheduled as of January 27th had a right to come to the United States. And so those people have been coming throughout the month of February. But there are no guarantees for future.
Well, and there were cases where people were literally in the air when the order took effect, and they thought they had done everything they needed to do and cleared all those hurdles and landed at the airport and were turned back. So have you heard anecdotally any stories about people who are reluctant to start the process again in this sort of more tenuous period of the stay?
Because we don't have connection with people before they arrive, we only have information that we receive from PRM. So we really have no influence on pre-arrival. And that includes knowing anything that they might be thinking, you know, before they arrive. We do know that there are some very concerned family members that were expecting loved ones, and they're definitely affected. Refugee resettlement, also, though, we are a nonprofit business, and even though we are nonprofit, we still have to pay staff and maintain operations, and that has deeply affected us. And I know the other agencies in the area, it's affected them as well. We're very concerned. Our work ultimately has to do with human beings, and when we're affected, we know that other people are affected as well.
So if your capacity is a function of your funding, and your funding is tied to how many families you're taking care of, when the families stop coming, presumably that impacts the funding, and you have to do what any organization does when there's not funding, and that's contract and cut back. So are the thoughts going forward if your capacity is shrunk and then suddenly the flow starts again? I mean, how quickly can you respond?
Well, I'm fortunate to be with an agency that has always been thoughtful. And, I've been working for them for over 25 years, so hopefully I've absorbed some of that thoughtfulness. We've been conservative for the past 4 months in how we've been doing our operations. We've been very thoughtful about allocation of our staff resources and operational expenses. So I feel that we've done about the best that we can do. We've downsized where we could. We have cut expenses where we could. And we're just going to hang on, because from day to day and from week to week, since January 27th, this situation has been extremely fluid. And we need to respond and not react. Reaction is emotional. Response is hopefully a thoughtful plan of action.
So what do you hear from the families that you work with about the current situation? I mean, how do they see this?
That is a big question. Refugees came to the United States with great hopes and dreams for the opportunity of the United States, and opportunities that you and I take for granted. We took an older refugee group, elders, who get really isolated when they come here. So we have a special program in which we take them out into the community and get them excited about Wisconsin and government and achieving the American dream of citizenship. And they told me that they would have never been allowed to go to a zoo. And when they choose the trips, they choose Old World, Wisconsin, the state capitol building. They wanted to meet Mayor Tom Barrett and go to City Hall, and he was gracious enough to put time into his schedule. They wanted to go to a cranberry bog. That's the kind of things that they want to go to. They yearn to learn about their new country. So this upheaval, current upheaval, and until the dust settles, they are concerned. And I'm concerned because this isn't just a refugee matter. The changes that are going on right now affect me as well. This is a job for me. And if there are no refugees, then I also have to look for a job myself. So this is not just a refugee issue. There are hotels that hire refugees and look to us to supply qualified, stable, consistent workers for them, meatpacking plants. So there's a ripple effect going on here. Refugees are concerned that they will be deported, and that is really sad for us to see. And it's our job, once again, to remind them that as it pertains to the executive order, refugees did arrive with full permanent legal status. And we just need to reassure them about that in a calm manner, because that is their legal right.
Well, we're kind of running out of time here, but I'd like your thoughts on just what's driving some of this concern about refugees. And it's really not confined to the U.S. I mean, we see some of the political parties in the EU, for example, that have really been founded on anti-immigrant, anti-immigration, and anti-refugee rhetoric. What do you think is the origins of that?
I can only speak from my heart, and I can only state my opinion. But what is going on is war. And people are fleeing for their lives. As an American, I have not experienced war right outside my front door, but the people that I work with have. And I can't even imagine what that's like. This is war, and people are fleeing to the closest potentially safe place that they can get. And so countries that border Syria, border Burma, border Somalia, people are fleeing for their lives, and it's just as basic as that. We can't imagine what that's like here, and I hope we never do. But I think that we have a responsibility as an international partner to do our due diligence in partnership with other countries in the world. You mentioned Canada earlier, and Canada is willing to take quite a few people in a very different manner than we do. I think that we've got a really good system, but what does that say about us? I still believe we're a wonderful country and a very welcoming country. I think we just have to take some time for everybody to learn the process and get acquainted with the information. And I think it's going to come together, and I think we're going to be okay.
Well, we now have a clock ticking with 120 days, so the hope is everyone will be less concerned about the deficiencies of the vetting process, and we'll go forward. So, well, we'll keep an eye on that, as I'm sure will you. Mary Flynn, thank you very much for joining us. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.